was to Dr. Christian Barnard and his team the culmination of years of painstaking and repeated experiments of heart transplant on animals. It is the success from those surgical operations and heart transplants on animals that strengthened their resolve to take their game to a higher level, carrying out a human heart transplant.
And in about 1964, Barnard started doing experimental heart transplants on dogs. He did 48 in total. Dr. Norman Shumway and Richard Lower in 1958 started doing heart transplants on dogs. And it was Shumway's original technique. They did hundreds of transplants on dogs and taught many other doctors and published all their work. They had quite a few opportunities to try it on a human, but they didn't have the courage to do it because of the law in America regarding the legal death of the donor. And then the law in South Africa permitted Barnard to eventually do a transplant after he'd done his 48 experiments. And after he did it, they all started transplanting. And I think they were a little bit annoyed that he got in first.
Among the men and women with whom Dr. Christian Barnard worked over the years to perfect the science was Hamilton Naki. He was a black South African and, surprisingly, only a gardener. But given the opportunity to assist Barnard in his experiments on animals, he used the training offered to attain a level of surgical precision on animals that thoroughly outshined his beginner's educational background.
Now, in 1956, Barnard went to Minnesota in America to specialize in cardiac surgery. And when he came back, he brought with him the first heart-lung bypass machine, which then enabled him to do the first open-heart surgery in Africa in 1958. The machine was similar to this over here. It's called a bubble oxygenator. And before he could use this, he had to practice on dogs and baboons. He had to practice using this machine. And to do that, they had to train the laboratory attendants to assist them with the surgery and the anesthetics. They didn't have the money to appoint properly qualified technicians to help them. And there was one man who did especially well. His name was Hamilton Naki. This was him over here. He was basically a cleaner. All of them, there was a big list of, a big team of people who maintained the laboratories and all the equipment and assisted generally with his operations. But he did extremely good work along with his colleagues and played a very important role in all the research, and also Marius Barnard, Chris's brother.
Dr. Christian Barnard was an exceptionally intelligent and gifted surgeon who was already well known in South Africa and some parts of the world. However, his confidence as he carried on with this groundbreaking heart transplant did not only rest on self-belief. The pedigree of the medical team, support staff, nurses and doctors, some of them specialists in their own right, reassured Dr. Barnard as he set out on that feat of pioneering surgery.
There were more than 40 people altogether involved in this first heart transplant. Not everybody, of course, was in the operating rooms. About half of them were behind the scenes, various technicians and specialists and so on. Now, this gentleman here was Professor Schrerer. He was the cardiologist, the head of the Department of Cardiology. He started the first cardiac clinic at this hospital. And he was a very clever man and worked very closely with Barnard. And together they decided it was now time to try this new heart transplant. He didn't agree to start off with, but eventually came around to Barnard's way of thinking, and he said, right, let's go for it. And he then referred Mr. Washkansky as the first patient. Then we have Professor Ozinski, who had the awesome task of, for the very first time, anesthetizing somebody whose heart was being removed. So as you can imagine, with the technology that they had those days, they didn't have the anesthetics either. It was a very difficult task, and as this very interesting poster says, in those days the anesthetics really depended more on the skill of the anaesthetist than the actual anesthetics. The other anaesthetists in the donor theatre, Dr. Cecil Moss, he's still alive and visited us recently, well over 80 and very fit and strong. The immunologist, that was also a new subject, a fairly new subject in those days, you know, the subject of rejection, and he was an expert in his field in those days. The rejection of the organ was putting off a lot of people from doing the transplants because they didn't feel they knew enough, but they were willing to take the chance. And then we have Barnard and his chief assistant there, Dr. Hewitson. Barnard always referred to his team as an orchestra. He said, you know, they all had their role to play, they knew what they each had to do, and he was just the conductor of this orchestra.
This is the actual theatre block where the various facets of the history-making human heart transplant took place almost 43 years ago. It all started here in the donor theatre.
I must stress that this really is where it all happened. This is the actual theatre where Denise Darville's heart was removed. This is a model of her on the operating table. These models don't resemble anybody in particular, I just want to point that out. And the surgeon in charge here was Marius Barnard, Chris's brother. And he had an assistant. There was a kidney surgeon as well, because the kidneys were also harvested, and a 10-year-old boy in another hospital 20 kilometers away got one of her kidneys. Then there was the anaesthetist, Dr. Cecil Moss, whose job here is mainly to keep that heart going until they're ready to stop it and remove it. And he also gives a mild anesthetic to relax the muscles. Then there were two technicians operating the heart-lung machine. And the heart-lung machine they used in this theatre that night was the old one from the animal laboratory. And then you have the two scrub nurses. Now this theatre, as the other one, has been restored to exactly as it was in 1967. The theatres all got changed as the years went on, but this is as it was, with the green paint and the green tiles and the original lamp, etc. Now Denise was wheeled in here just before 2 a.m. and just after 2, her respirator was switched off, and they actually waited for the heart to stop beating. Even though legally in this country she had been proclaimed dead, she'd been certified dead, they wanted the heart to stop as well. And that's why they first switched off the respirator and waited for the heart to stop, and only then was she declared dead. The chest was then opened. She was very quickly connected to the heart-lung machine so that they could have cool, oxygenated blood going through the heart to preserve it. And then Christian came from the other theatre, and he himself removed the heart and carried it through to the theatre next door. Now, this is where world history was really made, where all the drama took place. This is where the heart was actually transplanted. And again, this theatre has been set up to look exactly as it did on the night, with equipment similar to what they used that night. Christian Barnard is the surgeon on that side of the table, looking down, on the patient's right, looking down. He's the only one who resembles himself. And the patient behind the screen, you'll see, also looks like himself. This is the exact number of people he had in these theatres. It was Barnard, and opposite him his chief assistant, a surgical registrar next to him, 2 scrub nurses, a floor nurse, the anaesthetist, and the anaesthetics nurse. And if you follow me around the other side, I'll show you the original heart-lung machine that was used that night. Here we have the original heart-lung bypass machine that was actually used that night. It's not 100% complete, but this is it. This is a very historical piece of equipment. and this took over the work of the heart and the lungs during the operation. It was set